Mrs. Julia was an elderly lady with white hair and a frail stature, with a weary but still dignified look in her eyes. At 90 years old, she had become a homeless person, after losing everything she had built up over the course of her life. Her past was a mix of joys and sorrows. Julia had been a family woman, married to the love of her life, Jose, with whom she had 2 children. They led a simple but happy life in a small apartment in the city center. But the happiness did not last forever. A few years ago, Julia became a widow when Jose suddenly passed away from a heart attack. Without her husband, she became dependent on her children, who were unable to care for her. Over time, they moved away, leaving Julia increasingly alone. Without family, job, or income, Julia could not keep up with the rent on her apartment. She ended up losing her home, and with nowhere to go, was forced to live on the streets of the city. The woman who had once been a dedicated housewife was now just another forgotten figure among the hurried passers-by. Julia carried with her few mementos of her past, kept in a small, worn-out bag she always had with her. Her clothes were worn and dirty, and her aged body struggled to endure the harshness of life on the streets. But even in this terribly difficult situation, Julia maintained a glimmer of hope in her gaze, hoping that one day her life could change again. Waking up with the rising sun, cold and weary. She needs to move around to warm up a bit. Mrs. Julia gets up with difficulty, her joints aching from the cold of the night. She rubs her eyes and looks around, seeing the familiar faces of other homeless people, huddled in their corners. "Good morning, Mr. Joao. How did you pass the night?" she says, with her weak voice. "Ah, Mrs. Julia, the same as always. Cold and hungry," he replies, shaking his head. Julia sighs and begins her daily routine. First, she needs to find something to eat. She walks slowly through the streets, carrying her worn-out bag, gently asking passers-by, "Please, do you have a little food you could give me? I'm so hungry." Many ignore her, some look at her with disdain. But some people are moved and give her a few coins or scraps of food. Julia thanks each one, storing what she's managed to get in her bag. Then, she needs to find a safe place to spend the day. She knows of some hiding spots under awnings or in abandoned buildings, where she settles as best she can. In these moments, she feels a deep loneliness. She misses her home, her family, a real home. "Oh, Jose, how I miss you. If only my children were still here with me," she murmurs, letting a tear roll down her wrinkled face. The day passes slowly. Julia dozes off a bit, struggling against the cold and hunger. When night falls, she curls up in her corner, praying that sleep will take her to a better world, away from the difficulties she faces every day. Another day began and Mrs. Julia knew she had to find something to eat. Her stomach was growling and her weak body begged for nourishment. She dragged herself through the streets, with her slow and weary steps, until she reached a small diner in the city center. With a sigh, Julia pushed open the door and entered the establishment. The smell of fresh food almost made her faint from hunger. She walked slowly to the counter, where a young waiter stared at her with disdain. "Excuse me, young man. Could you please give me something to eat? I'm so hungry," she requested humbly. The waiter looked her up and down, with a disgusted expression on his face. "Look here, Grandma, we don't serve beggars in this place. Get out of here before I call the police," he responded rudely and gruffly. Julia felt her heart sink. She knew her appearance as a homeless person didn't help, but this rejection was too much. "Please, sir. I just need a little food. I'm starving and have nowhere to get any," she pleaded, with tears in her eyes. Another employee, who seemed to be the manager, approached and pushed her towards the exit. "We've got the message, you useless old hag. Now get out of here before we call the police. Nobody wants you in this diner stinking of the street," he yelled furiously. Julia couldn't hold back the tears streaming down her face. She turned and left the diner, defeated, her stomach growling with hunger. That rejection had been another harsh lesson about the cruelty of the world she lived in. Miss Fernanda was hurrying through the streets, lost in her own thoughts, when she heard the commotion coming from the diner. Curious, she approached and witnessed the unfolding scene. She watched, aghast, at the disrespectful way the employees were treating that frail and unprepared elderly woman. Her serene expression soon turned to indignation. How can they be so cruel to this poor woman? She's just begging for a little food, Fernanda thought, feeling her heart tighten. Without hesitation, she entered the diner and approached the counter, staring the manager down firmly. "What do you think you're doing? How can you treat that lady that way?" she questioned in a severe tone. The manager, surprised by the intervention, tried to justify himself. "She's just another smelly beggar who's bothering our customers. We can't allow those people to hang around here." Fernanda shook her head, outraged by that response. "Beggar? This lady deserves the same respect and consideration as any of you. She is a person, not trash," she retorted, leaving the manager speechless. Turning to Mrs. Julia, Fernanda looked at her with compassion. "My dear, please come with me. I'll offer you something to eat," she said in a gentle tone, extending her hand to the elderly woman. Julia could hardly believe what was happening. This elegant, well-dressed woman was really willing to help her. She accepted the outstretched hand, feeling a bit embarrassed. "Thank you so much, my dear. May God bless you for your kindness," Julia murmured, moved. Together, they left the diner, leaving the ashamed employees and a furious manager behind, scolded for his behavior. As they walked together, Miss Fernanda couldn't help but notice the gold pendant hanging from Mrs. Julia's neck. The small object shimmered in the sunlight, contrasting with the elderly woman's worn and dirty clothes. Curious, Fernanda moved a little closer and examined the pendant more closely. She noticed that despite the wear, it was still a valuable item. This made her wonder how a seemingly poor woman could have something so precious. "My lady, excuse me, but that pendant is very beautiful. May I ask where you got it?" Fernanda inquired gently. Mrs. Julia seemed surprised by the question, but soon replied, with a distant look. "Oh, this pendant. It belonged to my mother. She gave it to me when I got married, many, many years ago," she said, touching the pendant softly. Fernanda became even more intrigued. How could this poor woman, now living on the streets, have such a precious, possibly family heirloom? "But, my dear, if you have gone through so many difficulties to the point of living on the streets, how do you still manage to keep this pendant?" she questioned, genuinely curious. Julia sighed, her eyes filling with tears. "Ah, my child, this pendant is the last remnant I have of my family. I've never been able to part with it, no matter how difficult my life has become," she answered, caressing the pendant with affection. Observing Mrs. Julia's expression, Fernanda felt a wave of compassion come over her. This woman, despite all the adversity, still held on to something so precious and meaningful. She couldn't help but be impressed by the strength and dignity of that elderly lady. As Miss Fernanda observed that elderly woman, carrying her precious pendant with so much care, something stirred within her. That scene made her remember her own childhood, which had not been the easiest. Fernanda came from a humble family. Her father was a factory worker and her mother, a seamstress. They lived in a small apartment in the suburb of the city, constantly struggling to put food on the table and pay the bills. Often, Fernanda remembered having to go to bed hungry, cuddled up with her siblings, dreaming of a better future. Despite the difficulties, her mother always made a point of keeping a valuable object in the family, a gold brooch that had belonged to her grandmother. This brooch was like a treasure to them, a reminder of better times and the importance of never losing hope. Seeing Mrs. Julia's pendant, Fernanda couldn't help but identify with that story. She knew how much that small object must have meant to the elderly woman, being the only connection she had left to her lost family. "My dear, I understand how precious this pendant must be to you. It reminds you of better times, doesn't it?" Fernanda said with compassion. Julia nodded, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "Yes, my child. This pendant is all that's left of my past. It reminds me of the love of my family, which has unfortunately gone," she responded, her voice trembling. Fernanda felt her heart tighten even more. Seeing that woman so alone and helpless touched her deeply. She remembered how much her own family had struggled to survive, and imagined how difficult Mrs. Julia's journey must have been. In that moment, Fernanda made a decision. She needed to find a way to help this woman and ensure she had a more dignified and comfortable end of life. As they walked together through the streets, Mrs. Fernanda couldn't take her eyes off Mrs. Julia. The image of the frail and helpless elderly woman, carrying with her the only object that remained of her family, touched Fernanda's heart deeply. She vividly remembered her own difficult childhood, the sleepless nights with the rumbling of her stomach, the anguish of not knowing if there would be food on the table the next day. This memory made her feel even more empathy for Mrs. Julia's situation. How is it possible that this lady has been abandoned in this way? She deserves so much more than this life on the streets, begging for crumbs, Fernanda thought, feeling the indignation growing within her. Without hesitation, the wealthy woman made a decision. She needed to do something to help that elderly woman, no matter what was necessary. Fernanda knew that if she were in a similar situation, she would beg for a chance to start over. "I can't just leave her here, alone and helpless. I have to try to change the fate of this poor woman," she said firmly, determined to put her plan into action. Turning to Mrs. Julia, Fernanda looked at her with a loving and determined gaze. "My dear, I can't just leave you in this situation. You deserve so much more than this life on the streets. Let me help you in some way," she said, gently touching Julia's arm. Julia was surprised by the offer, her eyes widened with a mixture of hope and distrust. "Help me? But, my child, what could you do for a poor old woman like me?" she questioned, with disbelief. Fernanda smiled, gripping Julia's arm more firmly. "You'll see, my dear. I'll do everything to change your life. You won't be alone in this world anymore," she affirmed, with determination. Julia felt her heart fill with hope for the first time in a long while. Perhaps, after so much sorrow, her life could really take an unexpected turn. After making her promise to help Mrs. Julia, Miss Fernanda knew she needed to act quickly. She didn't want to leave the elderly woman waiting for too long. After all, life on the streets had already been hard enough. Fernanda gently placed her hand on Julia's shoulder and encouraged her to walk with her. "Come, my dear. I know a place where we can get you something good to eat," she said in a welcoming tone. Julia hesitated for a moment, still distrustful of this elegant woman who was willing to help her. "But, my child, why are you doing this for me? I don't even know you," she questioned, with an uncertain gaze. Fernanda smiled with understanding, comprehending the elderly woman's distrust. "Oh, my dear, I'm sorry. I didn't even introduce myself properly," she said, extending her hand. "My name is Fernanda. And I want to help you because I know how hard it is to live on the street, without a home and without food. You deserve so much more than that." Julia squeezed Fernanda's hand, still a bit reluctant, but feeling a spark of hope. "Pleased to meet you, my child." "I'm Julia," she responded, in a faint voice. Fernanda smiled affectionately, gently squeezing the elderly woman's hand. "Let's go, Julia. I'll take you to a delicious restaurant, where you can eat to your heart's content," she said, with enthusiasm. Julia hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, allowing herself to be guided by Fernanda. This woman seemed to truly want to help her, and she was so hungry that she couldn't reject the offer. They began walking together, Fernanda maintaining a slow pace to match Julia's weary steps. The elderly woman felt her heart fill with a strange sensation, a mixture of relief and distrust. Would this kindness last? As they walked towards the restaurant, Mrs. Julia couldn't help but feel oddly uncomfortable. This elegant and gentle woman, Fernanda, seemed to truly want to help her, but Julia was not used to receiving this kind of treatment. After all, in recent years, she had experienced only the cruelty and disdain of people. Being ignored, mistreated, and rejected had become a constant in her life on the streets. So this sudden generosity left her completely distrustful. Why is this woman doing this for me? What does she want in return? Julia wondered, as they walked side by side. She cast furtive glances at Fernanda, trying to understand her true intentions. Was this kindness real or just another trap to humiliate her even more? When they arrived at the restaurant, Fernanda opened the door gently, inviting Julia to enter. "Come, my dear. You can sit here and eat to your heart's content," she said, with a kind smile. Julia hesitated, taking a tentative step forward. "But, my child, I don't have money to pay for food here. I don't want to cause any trouble," she murmured, embarrassed. Fernanda shook her head, gently holding Julia's arm. "Don't worry about that, my dear. I'll pay for everything. You don't have to worry about anything," she responded in a soothing tone. Julia became even more confused. This woman seemed to truly want to help her, without asking for anything in return. She couldn't understand why someone would do that. But why? "Why are you doing this for me?" Julia questioned, her eyes full of distrust. Fernanda smiled with understanding, holding Julia's hand with affection. "Because you deserve so much more than this life on the streets, my dear. I want to help you have a better life, if you'll let me," she responded, with sincerity. Julia remained silent for a few moments, carefully analyzing Fernanda's words. This woman seemed to be telling the truth, but Julia still couldn't believe that someone would care so much about her. After a long hesitation, Julia slowly nodded, allowing Fernanda to guide her into the restaurant. Perhaps, just this once, she could trust the kindness of a stranger. Seated at a comfortable table in the restaurant, Mrs. Julia watched in disbelief as Mrs. Fernanda ordered a generous meal for her. This situation was so strange and unusual that the elderly woman couldn't feel completely at ease. Fernanda, sensing Julia's distrust, decided to try to break it with a friendly conversation. "So, my dear, tell me a little about yourself. How did you end up in this situation?" she asked gently. Julia hesitated for a moment, still reluctant to trust this unknown woman. However, something in her warm gaze and her words made her believe that she truly wanted to help. With a sigh, Julia began to recount her story. "Oh, my child, my life has not been easy. I was a married woman, with 2 children, and we lived in a small apartment in the city center," she said, her eyes lost in the memories of the past. Fernanda listened attentively, maintaining her gentle and understanding gaze. My husband, Jose, worked hard to support the family. We were happy, even though we didn't have many possessions, Julia continued, a slight smile on her tired face. However, Julia's expression soon clouded over when she reached the most painful part of her story. But a few years ago, everything changed. Jose passed away suddenly, from a heart attack, she revealed, her voice trembling with emotion. After that, my children had to move away because of their jobs, and I was left alone. Fernanda felt her heart tighten upon hearing this sad story. She could imagine how devastating it must have been for Julia to lose her husband and then be abandoned by her own family. Without Jose and without my children, I couldn't afford the apartment rent anymore. I ended up losing everything and found myself forced to live on the streets, Julia concluded, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. Fernanda reached out and gently squeezed Julia's hand in a gesture of comfort. My dear, I'm so sorry for all you've been through. No one should have to face such adversity, she said, her voice filled with empathy. Julia nodded, wiping away her tears with a weary gesture. Yes, my child. These last few years have been very difficult. But despite everything, I still have this pendant, which reminds me of happier times, she responded, touching the small object with affection. In that moment, Fernanda felt even more moved by Mrs. Julia's life story. This woman had faced so many hardships, yet she still maintained her dignity and a spark of hope. This inspired Fernanda even more to help her in some way. As she listened attentively to Mrs. Julia's sad story, Mrs. Fernanda felt her heart tighten more and more. This elderly and fragile woman had gone through so many difficulties, losing everything she loved and being left alone to face the cruelty of the streets. Fernanda could imagine how devastating it must have been for Julia to lose her husband and then be abandoned by her own children. She herself had experienced a humble childhood, constantly struggling to survive, so she perfectly understood the desperation and loneliness that Julia must have felt. My God, this poor woman has had such a difficult life. She doesn't deserve to live this way, begging for crumbs and sleeping on the cold streets. Fernanda thought, feeling an immense wave of compassion wash over her. Observing Julia's wrinkled face, Fernanda noticed the sadness and fatigue in her eyes. Despite all the suffering, the elderly woman still maintained a spark of dignity and willpower in her gaze. This moved her even more. Extending her hand, Fernanda gently held Julia's, looking at her with a caring gaze. My dear, I can't even imagine how much you must have suffered. You are such a resilient woman, despite everything you've faced, she said, with genuine admiration. Julia lowered her gaze, still a bit embarrassed. Oh, my child, I just did what I could to survive. But these last few years on the streets have been a true ordeal, she responded, her voice faltering. Fernanda squeezed Julia's hand more tightly, determined to change the course of her life. Well, my dear, don't worry anymore. I won't let you continue in this situation. I'll do everything in my power to improve your life, she affirmed, with conviction. Julia's eyes widened, surprised by Fernanda's determination. But, my child, what could you do for an old woman like me? She questioned, still distrustful. Fernanda smiled confidently, squeezing Julia's hand once more. You'll see, my dear. I'll take care of you and make sure you have a home and a dignified life again, she responded, with a resolute expression. In that moment, Julia felt a small flame of hope ignite in her heart. Perhaps, after so many years of loneliness and sorrow, her life could truly change. After lunch, Mrs. Fernanda couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Julia's moving story. This strong and resilient woman had gone through so much suffering, and Fernanda felt a deep need to help her regain her dignity and her home. As soon as she bid farewell to Julia, Fernanda quickly returned to her office, determined to launch an investigation into the elderly woman's past life. She knew that in order to effectively help her, she would need to uncover more details about her history. First, Fernanda reached out to her most trusted contacts, asking them to research any available information about Mrs. Julia. She provided the elderly woman's full name, as well as some basic information she had gathered during their conversation. "I need you to scour everything you can about this woman. Where she lived, where she worked, what happened to her family. I want to know everything," Fernanda instructed, her voice laden with determination. Her assistants immediately set to work, tracking down public records, newspaper archives, and other sources of information. Fernanda closely followed the progress of the investigation, eager to learn more about Julia's life. A few hours later, one of her employees knocked on the door, holding a folder with several documents. "Mrs. Fernanda, we were able to gather some relevant information about Mrs. Julia," he said, handing her the folder. Fernanda opened it quickly, her eyes scanning each page with attention. "So, what did you find?" she questioned, barely containing her anxiety. "Well, according to the records, Mrs. Julia lived in a small apartment in the city center. She was married to a man named Jose, and they had 2 children," the assistant explained, pointing to the documents. Fernanda nodded, remembering the story told by Julia. Yes. "Please continue," she encouraged, impatient. "Unfortunately, Mrs. Julia's husband passed away a few years ago. After that, her children had to move away for their jobs, leaving her alone," he continued, his tone growing increasingly somber. "And then?" Fernanda questioned, feeling her heart tighten. "Well, our investigation indicates that Mrs. Julia was unable to pay the rent on the apartment and ended up losing her home. Since then, she has been living on the streets, without any family or financial support," the assistant concluded, with sorrow. Fernanda closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing this devastating information. Her determination to help Mrs. Julia only increased with each new revelation. "Very well. Thank you for the work. Now, I need you to find out everything you can about Mrs. Julia's current whereabouts and how I can get in touch with her family," she ordered, with firmness. She knew she needed to act quickly to rescue that woman from life on the streets and reunite her with her family. Julia deserves so much more than a life of misery and abandonment. After hours of investigating Mrs. Julia's life, Mrs. Fernanda finally obtained some surprising information. She summoned her main assistant to discuss the newly discovered details. "So, what did you find out about Mrs. Julia's past?" Fernanda questioned, anxious to get more answers. The assistant flipped through some documents before looking at Fernanda with a serious expression. "Mrs. Fernanda, during our investigation, we found something very interesting about the pendant that Mrs. Julia carries with her," he began, leaving the businesswoman even more intrigued. "The pendant has been in Mrs. Julia's family for generations. It was given to her on the day of her marriage to Jose, as a symbol of their love," the assistant explained, carefully. Fernanda nodded, remembering the story Julia had told her earlier. "Yes, I knew that. But what else did you discover?" she pressed, impatient. The assistant took a deep breath before continuing. "Well, according to our findings, this pendant has a special meaning for Mrs. Julia. It not only represents her connection to her family, but it's also related to a very tragic event in her life," he revealed, with caution. Fernanda furrowed her brow, feeling a shiver of concern. "Tragic? What do you mean?" she questioned, dreading the answer. "Mrs. Fernanda, We found that many years ago, when Mrs. Julia was a young newlywed, her first child tragically passed away, the assistant said, with sorrow. The pendant she carries was the last gift the baby received from his parents. Fernanda brought her hand to her mouth, shocked by this revelation. She couldn't imagine the pain Mrs. Julia must have endured in losing such a young child. My God! That explains why this pendant is so precious to her. It's the only memento she has left of that child, Fernanda murmured, her voice choked with emotion. The assistant nodded, full of empathy. Exactly. This pendant has become a symbol of the memory of her son, and Mrs. Julia has never been able to part with it, even amidst all the difficulties she has faced, he concluded, with compassion. In that moment, Fernanda felt her heart break. Understanding the significance of that pendant, and all the suffering it represented for Mrs. Julia, made her even more certain that she needed to save her from that helpless life. She knew she had to act quickly to restore dignity and hope to this resilient woman. After their meal, Mrs. Fernanda invited Mrs. Julia to accompany her to a more peaceful location, where they could talk with more privacy. The elderly woman, still a bit distrustful, reluctantly accepted the invitation. As soon as they sat on a park bench, Fernanda took Julia's hands in hers, looking at her gently. "My dear, I need to ask you something about that very special pendant you carry," she said, softly. Julia looked at the pendant hanging from her neck, caressing it with a loving gesture. "Oh, my child, this pendant means everything to me," she responded, her voice choked with emotion. Fernanda squeezed Julia's hand slightly, encouraging her to continue. "Please, my dear, tell me the story behind it. I want to understand what it represents for you," she requested, with empathy. Julia took a deep breath, her eyes filling with tears. "This pendant. It belonged to my son," she revealed, with difficulty. "My first and only child, who unfortunately passed away as a baby." Fernanda felt her heart tighten at those words. She could imagine the pain Julia must have felt in losing her own child. "Oh, my dear, I had no idea," she murmured, squeezing the elderly woman's hands more tightly. Julia nodded, the tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "Yes, my child. That was the worst moment of my life. Losing my baby was a pain I could never fully overcome," she said, her voice faltering. Fernanda listened attentively, deeply moved by the story. "This pendant was the last gift my son received from us. After he was gone, this small object became the only memento I had left of him," Julia continued, caressing the pendant with reverence. She lifted her gaze, looking at Fernanda with an expression of gratitude. "And that's why I could never part with this pendant, no matter how difficult my life has become. It's all I have left of my baby," she concluded, the tears flowing freely down her face. Fernanda felt her vision blur, her own tears threatening to spill. This revelation had touched her deeply. She could now understand the emotional significance of that small object for Mrs. Julia. In that moment, Fernanda felt even more determined to help this resilient woman, who carried such a heavy burden in her heart. She knew she had to do everything in her power to restore Julia's dignity and the hope she so deserved. As she listened to Mrs. Julia recount, with tears in her eyes, the tragic story behind the pendant she carried, Mrs. Fernanda felt her heart break into pieces. This revelation had touched her in a deep and unexpected way. Fernanda could imagine the pain and suffering Julia must have felt in losing her own child, especially being so young and newly married. The loss of a baby must have been a devastating experience, something no mother should have to face. And yet, Julia had managed to carry that burden for so many years, keeping the memory of her son alive through that simple, yet precious, pendant. Fernanda felt a wave of admiration and respect for the strength and resilience of this elderly woman. "My dear Julia, I don't even have the words to express how much your story has touched me," Fernanda said, holding the old woman's hands with care. Julia looked up, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Ah, my child, I've been through so many hardships in my life. But this pendant has always been my only connection to my beloved baby," she responded, caressing the object with tenderness. Fernanda nodded, feeling the tears stream down her face. "I understand, my dear. And that's why I feel even more determined to help you. You deserve so much more than this life on the streets, away from your family," she affirmed, with conviction. Julia shook her head, still a bit disbelieving. "But what could you do for me, my child?" "I'm just a poor old woman, with nothing to offer," she murmured, with sadness. Fernanda squeezed Julia's hands firmly, looking at her with determination. "You're mistaken, my dear. You are a wonderful woman who deserves to have her dignity and her life back," she said, with passion. "And I will do everything in my power to help you rebuild your life." Julia felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. This elegant and generous woman seemed truly willing to change the course of her story. In that moment, Fernanda felt deeply connected to Julia. She knew she needed to act quickly to get this woman off the streets and return her to a welcoming home. Her determination to help her had only grown stronger. After her emotional conversation with Mrs. Julia and the revelation of the story behind her precious pendant, Mrs. Fernanda became even more determined to help that woman rebuild her life. She knew she had to act quickly, before the elderly woman had to face the difficulties of the streets again. Back in her office, Fernanda began to devise a meticulous plan to rescue Julia. She summoned her trusted team and explained, in detail, what she intended to do. "I need you to help me find a permanent solution for Mrs. Julia's situation. She cannot continue living on the streets, exposed to so many dangers and deprivations," Fernanda said, firmly. Her assistants looked at her, attentive to the instructions. "First, I want you to contact Mrs. Julia's children. We need to locate them and convince them to welcome her back into their lives," she continued, determined. One of his employees nodded, jotting down the information. "Understood, Mrs. Fernanda. We will start a comprehensive search for those relatives and try to convince them to take Mrs. Julia back in," he confirmed. Fernanda smiled, satisfied with the readiness of her team. "Excellent. In the meantime, I want you to also look for suitable housing for her. Something comfortable and safe, where she can spend the rest of her days with dignity," she instructed. Another assistant raised his hand, with a suggestion. "Mrs. Fernanda, could we consider the possibility of accommodating her in one of our own properties? That way, we could ensure she has all the necessary support," he proposed. Fernanda nodded, appreciating the initiative. "Yes, that would be perfect. I want you to make sure everything is in place to turn that place into a true home for Mrs. Julia," she determined, with enthusiasm. Her employees nodded and immediately set to work, eager to execute the rescue plan. As they prepared for action, Fernanda couldn't contain her emotion. She knew that despite all the adversities, Mrs. Julia deserved to have a dignified and peaceful life. And she would do everything in her power to ensure that became a reality. "Wait, my dear Julia. Soon, you will have your home back," Fernanda murmured, with determination. As soon as Mrs. Fernanda's team received her instructions, they immediately sprang into action, determined to rescue Mrs. Julia from life on the streets as quickly as possible. First, they initiated a thorough search for Julia's children. After scouring various records, they were able to locate the addresses and contact information for the elderly woman's 2 children. One of the assistants then made several calls, trying to convince them to take their mother back into their lives. "Good morning, I'm calling on behalf of Mrs. Fernanda. We have found your mother, Mrs. Julia, and we would very much like for you to welcome her into your homes," he said, gently. On the other end of the line, the children seemed reluctant and surprised. "But what happened? We haven't heard from her in years," one of them exclaimed, disconcerted. The assistant took a deep breath before explaining the difficult situation Julia was in. "I'm sorry to inform you, but your mother is currently living on the streets, in precarious conditions. Mrs. Fernanda found her and is determined to help her rebuild her life," he revealed, with empathy. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, until Julia's children finally responded. We didn't know things were so bad. Of course, we'll come get her as soon as possible," one of them said, their voice choked with guilt. The assistant smiled, relieved. "Great. Mrs. Fernanda will arrange transportation to bring her to you. She will be very grateful to be reunited with her family," he responded, cheerfully. After the call, the assistant hurried to inform Mrs. Fernanda about the outcome of the conversation. "Mrs. Fernanda, we were able to reach Mrs. Julia's children. They were very moved to hear about her situation and agreed to welcome her back into their homes," he said, with a smile. Fernanda felt her eyes fill with tears of relief and joy. "That's wonderful. You have no idea how much this means to me," she exclaimed, emotional. "Now, arrange transportation to take her to her children as soon as possible." Her assistants nodded, promptly taking care of this final stage of the plan. As they waited for Mrs. Julia's arrival, Fernanda couldn't contain her anxiety. She knew this was just the first step in restoring the dignity and comfort to this resilient woman. "Soon, Mrs. Julia, you will have your family back. And I will make sure you have everything you need to live peacefully," Fernanda murmured, determined to ensure a happy ending to this story. After the tireless efforts of Mrs. Fernanda and her team, Mrs. Julia was finally rescued from the streets and taken back to her family. Her children, emotional and remorseful for having abandoned her, welcomed her with open arms. But Fernanda didn't stop there. She was determined to ensure that Julia had all the necessary conditions to rebuild her life with dignity and comfort. Thus, Fernanda arranged the purchase of a small but cozy apartment for the elderly woman. She personally oversaw the decoration, choosing comfortable furniture and items that would remind Julia of her family's happier times. "Here, my dear, this will be your new home," Fernanda said, with a radiant smile, showing the newly furnished apartment to a still incredulous Julia. The elderly woman walked through the house, her eyes filling with tears at such generosity. "My God, my child, this is so beautiful. I don't even know how to thank you for everything you're doing for me," Julia exclaimed, emotional. Fernanda held her hand affectionately, looking at her with understanding. "You don't need to thank me, my dear. I just want to see you happy and comfortable again," she responded, gently squeezing Julia's hand. In the following days, Fernanda closely monitored Julia's adaptation to her new home. She made sure the elderly woman had all the necessary supplies, and also helped her reconnect with her children more frequently. To Fernanda's delight, Julia gradually resumed some of her favorite activities. She started cooking again, recreating the traditional dishes that were part of her history. She also returned to embroidery, an activity that calmed her and made her feel productive. "Look, my child, I'm already embroidering a new rug for my apartment," Julia said, proudly displaying her delicate work. Fernanda smiled, observing the serene expression on the elderly woman's face. "I'm so glad to see you engaging in your activities again, Mrs. Julia. This will help you feel at home," she responded, tenderly caressing Julia's arm. Gradually, Mrs. Julia adapted to her new reality. Although she still missed her husband and the son she had lost, she now had a comfortable home and the company of her family. And, above all, she had the constant and affectionate presence of Mrs. Fernanda, who had become a maternal figure in her life. "Thank you so much, my child. You have returned the dignity and hope that I had lost," Julia murmured, squeezing Fernanda's hand with gratitude. At that moment, Fernanda felt her heart swell with joy. She knew her mission was not complete, but seeing Julia gradually reclaiming her place in the world filled her with satisfaction. As Mrs. Fernanda closely followed the reconstruction of Mrs. Julia's life, an unexpected and profound bond began to form between the two women. What had started as a simple act of charity quickly transformed into a very meaningful emotional connection. Fernanda was surprised to notice how she felt increasingly closer and more protective towards Julia. She began to visit the elderly woman frequently, helping her adapt to the new home and resume her daily activities. During one of these visits, Fernanda found Julia lost in her memories, tenderly holding the pendant she cherished so much. "My dear, what are you thinking about?" Fernanda asked, sitting next to Julia on the sofa. The elderly woman smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "Oh, my child, I was just reminiscing about the happy times with my family," Julia responded, caressing the pendant. "This little object holds so many precious memories." Fernanda held Julia's hand, looking at her tenderly. "I can imagine how much this pendant means to you, my dear. It's a reminder of the love you had," she said, understanding. Julia nodded, looking up at Fernanda. "Yes, my child. And now, thanks to you, I have the chance to regain a bit of that happiness," she murmured, with gratitude. Fernanda felt her heart tighten at those words. She couldn't help but feel deeply connected to this elderly and resilient woman. "My dear Julia, you have no idea how much I care about you. I truly want you to have a peaceful and happy life from now on," Fernanda said, gently squeezing Julia's hand. Julia smiled, her eyes shining with emotion. "And you, my child, have no idea how much your presence has comforted me. It's as if you were a daughter I never had," she responded, affectionately. At that moment, Fernanda felt a strong connection form between them, almost like a mother-daughter relationship. She realized that in helping Julia, she had found something that was missing in her own life, the presence of a maternal figure. The two women embraced, letting tears of joy and gratitude flow freely. They had found in each other the support and comfort they both so desperately needed. From that day on, the bond between Mrs. Fernanda and Mrs. Julia grew even stronger. They became inseparable, sharing not only memories, but also the affection and care they so yearned for. As the days passed, the connection between Mrs. Fernanda and Mrs. Julia continued to strengthen. The two women became inseparable, sharing not only memories, but also the affection and care they both so desperately needed. In the midst of this closeness, Fernanda began to notice some physical similarities between Julia and her own family. Something about the elderly woman's face seemed strangely familiar to her, but she couldn't understand the reason. One day, during one of her visits, Fernanda decided to approach the subject delicately. "Mrs. Julia, I have something to ask you. Do you mind?" she said, hesitantly. Julia looked at her with a loving smile. "Of course not, my child. What do you want to know?" she responded, curious. Fernanda took a deep breath before continuing. "Well, I've noticed some similarities between us. Something about your face seems very familiar to me," she revealed, closely observing Julia's reaction. The elderly woman blinked, seeming surprised by the observation. "Similarities? Do you think we resemble each other, my dear? Julia questioned, with a pensive expression. Fernanda nodded, holding Julia's hand affectionately. Yes, I can't help but notice it. And thinking about it, your surname also sounds very familiar to me, she said, her eyes shining with anticipation. Julia was silent for a few moments, a wave of emotion taking over her face. My God, you don't think we could have some kind of family tie, do you? She murmured, her voice trembling. Fernanda felt her heart race. The possibility of having a blood connection between them deeply moved her. Yes, my dear Julia. I really think we might be relatives, she responded, her eyes glistening with tears. In that moment, the two women embraced, letting the tears flow freely. They couldn't believe the possibility of having discovered such a deep and unexpected bond. After that emotional moment, Fernanda and Julia decided to thoroughly investigate their origins. They traced Julia's family records and, to their surprise and delight, discovered that they were, in fact, distant relatives. Julia was actually Fernanda's second cousin. They had been separated by life, but fate had reunited them in an unexpected way. Moved by this revelation, the two women strengthened their ties even further. They began to treat each other as mother and daughter, cherishing every moment together to make up for lost time. Julia, who had already found a home in the company of her family, now felt complete. She had not only the material comfort, but also the love and affection of a dear relative. As for Fernanda, who had always felt the absence of a maternal figure in her life, she found in Julia the mother she had never had. Together, they formed a delightful duo, united by a connection that went far beyond simple friendship. And so, in this surprising and emotional conclusion, Mrs. Julia and Mrs. Fernanda discovered that, even in the face of life's adversities, family and love can triumph, in an unexpected and beautiful way.